Sirens tear through the night, not distant, not fading, but immediate, urgent, closing in. Across the skyline, people stop, mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-breath. They look up. At first, it's familiar. Thin streaks of light cutting across the darkness. Fast, controlled, predictable. Interceptors. For years, this is what safety has looked like. A silent system above their heads, catching threats before they arrive. And for a moment, it feels the same. Then, something changes. One of the streaks slows, not visibly, but something about it feels wrong. It doesn't vanish in a flash. It doesn't disappear. Instead, it splits. High above the city, the missile fractures not into debris, but into dozens of glowing points. They spread outward, quietly, almost beautifully, like sparks drifting in slow motion, except they aren't drifting. They're falling, dozens of them, not one impact, not one interception, but many, too many. People don't move at first, because there's nothing like this in memory, nothing to compare it to. The system was supposed to stop the threat, but the threat has changed. And now the sky itself feels uncertain, because for the first time in years, it's no longer clear where the danger will land, or if it can be stopped at all. For years, the sky above Israel has told a very different story, not one of chaos, but of control. When rockets were launched, people didn't panic the way they once did. They listened for the siren, they moved to shelter, and above them, unseen but trusted, something else responded. Interceptors, precise, calculated, fast, a system designed not just to react, but to decide. Within seconds, algorithms would calculate the trajectory of an incoming rocket. Not every threat needed to be stopped, only the ones that would hit something vital. A building, a street, a home, everything else was allowed to fall harmlessly. It wasn't just defense, it was selection. And over time, that precision built something more powerful than steel or circuitry. It built confidence. People began to believe, not blindly, but consistently, that the system worked, that it would hold. Because again and again, it did. Rockets came, interceptors rose, and in the sky, small flashes marked the moment danger was erased. It became routine, predictable, even reassuring. Parents would guide their children into shelters, not with panic, but with procedure, a practiced calm, because above them something was watching, something was responding, something was in control. But that control depended on a fragile balance, speed, timing, and a simple assumption that every threat could be tracked and stopped before it reached its target. An assumption that held true until the night the sky stopped behaving the way it was supposed to. The change didn't come all at once. It rarely does. At first, it appeared in fragments, reports, briefings, statements that seemed routine on the surface. Another escalation, another exchange, another warning. But beneath that surface, something was shifting. On March 5th, a message appeared online. Not from a battlefield, but from an account tied to Iran's leadership. It showed a missile, sleek, oversized, arching across the sky toward a burning city. The caption was short, almost cryptic. Khorramshahr moments are on the horizon. To most people, it meant very little. But to those watching closely, it meant everything. Because the Khorramshahr missile wasn't just another ballistic weapon. It represented a different kind of threat entirely. Not because of how far it could travel, but because of what it carried. A cluster warhead. Unlike conventional missiles, which deliver a single explosive impact, a cluster-equipped missile behaves differently. It doesn't simply strike. It opens. At a calculated point during its descent, the warhead separates, releasing dozens of smaller munitions into the air. Each one follows its own path. Each one becomes its own threat. Instead of one impact, there are many. Spread across streets, buildings, neighborhoods, and crucially, spread across time. Because they don't all fall at once. They scatter. They drift. They descend at slightly different speeds. To anyone on the ground, it doesn't look like a single attack. It looks like the sky is breaking apart. This wasn't entirely new technology. Cluster munitions had existed for decades, But their use here, combined with ballistic delivery systems, changed something fundamental. It wasn't just about hitting a target anymore. It was about overwhelming the idea of interception itself. Since the escalation began in late February, this shift became impossible to ignore. Missiles were still being launched, but now many of them carried these warheads, roughly half according to Israeli assessments, and with each launch, the rules of engagement changed. Because traditional missile defense is built on a simple sequence: detect the threat, track its path, intercept it before impact. But what happens when the threat doesn't stay whole? What happens when a single target becomes dozens, mid-air, beyond the point of interception? That question didn't remain theoretical for long, because soon, those scattered points of light in the sky would start reaching the ground. At first, the system still worked. Interceptors launched, targets were tracked, explosions lit up the sky exactly where they were supposed to. From a distance, it looked unchanged, but on the ground, something felt different. Because even when interceptions were successful, even when a missile was hit before it could reach the city, the danger didn't always disappear. Fragments still fell, not debris, something else, small, unpredictable, scattered, and then, slowly, the pattern became clear. Missiles were getting through, not in overwhelming numbers, but enough. Enough to change the feeling of certainty. Since the escalation began, at least 19 ballistic missiles carrying cluster warheads had penetrated Israeli airspace and struck urban areas. 19. It doesn't sound like much, until you understand what each one represents. Because each missile wasn't a single point of impact. It was dozens, dozens of falling threats, spreading across streets and neighborhoods, multiplying the danger in ways the system wasn't designed to handle. The consequences followed. People were injured, buildings were damaged, and for the first time in years, the shield above the country no longer felt absolute. In central Israel, one missile struck and injured 15 people, not because the system failed entirely, but because it didn't stop everything. And then came the morning of March 18th. Early, quiet, the kind of stillness that usually comes just before sunrise. Ramat Gan, just east of Tel Aviv, a couple in their 70s were inside their home. Routine, familiar, safe, until it wasn't. A cluster strike hit the area. They didn't survive. Elsewhere in Adonam, another life was lost. A 30-year-old worker far from home, caught in the same kind of attack. Different places, different people, the same pattern, the same sky, and the same realization beginning to take hold. This wasn't a total collapse of defense. The system was still intercepting many threats, still working, still saving lives, but it was no longer sealing the sky. Because even when a missile was stopped, even when the interception was successful, that didn't always mean the danger was gone. Sometimes, it meant it had already begun to spread. To understand what's happening, you have to look at a moment most people never see. Not the launch, not the impact, but the space in between. High above the earth, far beyond what's visible from the ground. That's where the outcome is decided. Because missile defense isn't about stopping something at the last second. It's about stopping it early. Very early. The moment a ballistic missile is detected, the system begins calculating speed, altitude, trajectory, where it will be in seconds, where it will be in minutes, where it will fall. And then, if it's deemed a threat, an interceptor is launched to meet it, not chase it, meet it at precisely the right point in space, at precisely the right moment in time. That timing is everything, because against a conventional missile, the equation is simple. One target, one intercept. Destroy the warhead before it reaches its destination, and the threat is gone. Clean. Contained, predictable, but cluster warheads break that equation because they don't stay intact. At a certain point during descent, often high in the atmosphere, the warhead opens, not from damage, not from interception, but by design. And when it does, the rules change instantly. One target becomes dozens, and those dozens don't behave the same way. They spread, they diverge. Each one following a slightly different path, a slightly different speed, a slightly different trajectory. From the perspective of the defense system, the situation transforms in seconds. What was once a single trackable object becomes a cloud of independent threats. Too many, too dispersed, too late, because by the time the warhead splits, the window for interception is already closing, or gone entirely. Even if an interceptor hits the original missile, even if the collision is successful, there's no guarantee the submunitions are neutralized. They may already be released, already falling, already beyond reach. And once that happens, there is no second line of defense capable of stopping each individual piece, not reliably, not at scale. Intercepting one missile is difficult. Intercepting dozens simultaneously mid-air across a wide area is something else entirely. It's not just a technological challenge, it's a physical one, a limitation of timing, of geometry, of distance, which means the system hasn't suddenly stopped working. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do, but it was designed for a different kind of threat, and now that difference is becoming impossible to ignore. From the ground, interception looks clean. A flash in the sky, a brief burst of light, and then nothing. The threat is gone. But what isn't visible is what it takes to make that moment happen. Every interception has a cost, not just in engineering, but in resources. Each interceptor missile is a complex system in itself: guidance, propulsion, targeting, built for a single purpose, to destroy one incoming threat, and once it's used, it's gone. In a conventional scenario, that exchange is manageable: one interceptor for one target. A clear balance. But cluster munitions disrupt that balance completely, because now a single incoming missile doesn't represent one threat, it represents many. And even if the system attempts to engage early, even if it launches interceptors before the warhead splits, there's no guarantee of success, which creates a dilemma. Do you commit more interceptors to ensure the kill? Do you fire again, just in case? Because if you don't, and the warhead opens, you're no longer dealing with one target. You're dealing with dozens. And at that point, interception becomes exponentially more difficult and exponentially more expensive. Weapons experts have pointed to a growing reality. Stopping these kinds of attacks may require using multiple interceptors against a single incoming missile, with no certainty that it will be enough. And once the submunitions are released, stopping each one individually isn't just difficult, it's not economically viable. It would mean expending vast numbers of high-cost interceptors against small, widely dispersed targets, a trade that simply doesn't scale, which introduces a new kind of pressure. Not just, can the system stop the threat, but can it afford to keep trying? Because war isn't only fought in moments of impact, it's fought over time, over stockpiles, over production, over how long a system can sustain the pace being demanded of it, and that may be the deeper strategy at play. Not just to get through the shield, but to exhaust it, to force decisions, to stretch the system beyond what it was designed to handle, not in a single strike, but across many. Because even the most advanced defense in the world has a limit, and for the first time, that limit is starting to come into view. At first, the sirens come in waves, separated, spaced out, predictable enough that life can still move in between them. People adjust, they learn the timing. They learn the routes to shelters. They learn how long they have. Seconds matter, but they are enough. And then, the spacing begins to shrink. Sirens return before the last one has fully faded. Day blends into night, and night into morning, without silence in between. There is no clear beginning, and no clear end. Only interruption, again, and again, and again. Phones buzz with alerts, windows tremble in the distance. Conversations stop mid-sentence, not out of panic, but recognition. It's happening again, and again. This is what saturation feels like, not a single overwhelming strike, but a constant pressure that never fully lifts. Because the attacks aren't just testing the system anymore. They're testing everything around it: the response time, the coordination, the endurance. And on the ground, something else begins to wear down. Not infrastructure, people. Sleep becomes fragmented, plans become uncertain, Normal routines, work, school, movement start to dissolve into contingency. Where is the nearest shelter? How long do we have? Is this one closer than the last? Questions that repeat so often. They stop feeling like questions. They become background noise. And that may be the most subtle shift of all. Fear doesn't always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives as fatigue, a slow erosion of certainty. Because even if the system continues to intercept most threats, even if it still works most of the time, the experience of living under it is changing. The sky is no longer just a place where danger appears and disappears. It's a place that demands constant attention, constant readiness, and over time, that readiness becomes exhausting. Not because people don't trust the system, but because they no longer trust the pattern. Because now, every siren carries a question it didn't carry before, not just when the impact will come, but how many times it might follow. By now, the system is still standing. Interceptors still rise, targets are still tracked, many threats are still destroyed before they reach the ground. From a distance, it still looks like control, but the gaps are no longer rare. They're visible. Over the course of a single weekend, barrages intensified, missiles came in groups, faster, closer together, forcing the system to respond again and again without pause. And then, in southern Israel, something slipped through. At least 2 ballistic missiles were not intercepted. They struck the cities of Arad and Dimona. Nearly 200 people were injured, not because the system had stopped working, but because it couldn't catch everything. That distinction matters. Because this isn't failure in the way people imagine it. There is no sudden collapse, no moment where defenses go dark. Instead, it's something quieter. A gradual widening of what gets through, a system under pressure, beginning to show its limits. At the same time, Israeli forces report progress elsewhere. More than 70% of Iran's ballistic missile launchers have been destroyed. Airspace control is tightening. Capabilities are being reduced. On paper, it looks like momentum is shifting. And yet, missiles are still being launched, still arriving, still finding their way through, which creates a strange and unsettling contradiction. How can both things be true at once? How can a system be winning and still be breached? The answer lies in how this kind of conflict is unfolding. Because this is no longer about a single exchange. It's not one side striking and the other responding. It's pressure applied continuously, in waves, in variations, in tactics, designed not to break the system instantly, but to stretch it, to force it to respond over and over again, until small gaps begin to appear. And once those gaps exist, they don't need to be large. They only need to be enough. Enough for one missile to pass. Enough for one warhead to open. Enough for dozens of sub-munitions to fall where even a successful interception might not have stopped them all. And on the ground, that difference is everything. Because people don't measure defense in percentages. They measure it in outcomes, in whether something landed or didn't, in whether a warning was followed by silence or by impact, which is why the feeling is beginning to shift, not toward panic, but toward uncertainty. Because the shield is still there, still active, still intercepting, but no longer absolute. And once that certainty begins to crack, even slightly, it changes how every siren sounds, not as reassurance, but as a question. By this point, it's tempting to describe what's happening as failure, a system pushed too far, a shield beginning to break. But that isn't entirely true, because the system itself hasn't changed. It still detects threats, still calculates trajectories, still launches interceptors with extraordinary precision. In many cases, it still works exactly as intended, which raises a more uncomfortable realization. The weakness isn't in the system. It's in the assumptions behind it. Modern missile defense was built around a certain idea of how threats behave, that a missile remains a single object, that it follows a predictable path, that if you intercept it at the right moment, the danger ends there. For years, that assumption held, because the threats match the model. But cluster munitions don't follow that logic. They don't present a single point of failure. They remove it. They take a problem that can be solved once and turn it into a problem that must be solved dozens of times, simultaneously and almost instantly. Not after impact, not even close to it, but in a narrow window high above the earth where timing must be exact. And if that moment is missed, even by seconds, the entire engagement changes. What was once a controlled interception becomes a dispersed event, not one explosion in the sky, but many potential impacts on the ground. And that shift is deliberate, because this isn't just about getting past the system, it's about reshaping the conditions the system depends on, forcing it into scenarios where its strengths matter less and its limits matter more. Speed becomes pressure, precision becomes strain, success becomes partial, which leads to a different kind of outcome, not a system that stops working, but one that can no longer guarantee certainty. And in a conflict like this, that difference is everything. Beyond the technology, beyond the systems and the calculations, there is another layer to this, one that doesn't appear on radar. Cluster munitions are not just difficult to intercept, they are difficult to control. By design, they spread across wide areas, releasing dozens of smaller explosives over whatever lies below. Not all of them detonate on impact. Some remain, unseen, unstable, waiting. Long after the sirens stop, long after the smoke clears, which means the danger doesn't end when the attack is over. It lingers, in streets, in fields, in places where people return, assuming the worst has already passed. This is why their use has long been contested. Under international humanitarian law, weapons that cannot distinguish between military targets and civilians, that spread harm indiscriminately, are considered deeply problematic. Many countries have agreed to ban them entirely, others have not. And in conflicts like this, those lines become blurred. Accusations move in both directions, each side pointing to the other, each claiming necessity, justification, legality. But on the ground, those distinctions become harder to see, because the effect is the same, a weapon that does not choose where it lands, a threat that continues even after the moment of impact, and civilians caught within that uncertainty, which shifts the question once more. Not just how these weapons change the battlefield, but what kind of battlefield they create. Because when the sky no longer delivers a single point of danger, but many, scattered and unpredictable, the line between target and bystander begins to disappear. At a distance, war is often measured in strikes. How many missiles launched, how many intercepted, how many targets hit, numbers, clean, countable. But over time, those numbers begin to matter less than something else. Duration. Because this kind of conflict isn't decided in a single exchange. It stretches, day after day, night after night, and with each cycle, the same questions return. How many interceptors remain? How many launchers are still active? How long can each side sustain what it's doing? This is where the balance begins to shift, not suddenly, but gradually. One side applies pressure, the other absorbs it. One side expends missiles, the other expends interceptors. And both are watching the same thing, not just what happens now, but what will still be possible tomorrow, because even the most advanced defense system depends on something finite: stockpiles, production, time, and the same is true for the side launching the attacks. Missiles can be built, replaced, adapted, but not infinitely, which turns the conflict into something slower and more uncertain, a test of endurance, not just of technology, but of resilience, of how long systems can operate under constant demand, of how long civilians can live under constant alert, of how long the balance can hold before something gives. Because in the end, the question isn't only who can strike or who can defend, it's who can continue. And in a war like this, that answer is rarely clear until it's already been decided. The sky hasn't disappeared. It still stretches above the city, wide open, unchanged in appearance, but it doesn't feel the same, not anymore. There was a time when danger came in a single line. A missile traced a path, a system tracked it, an interception erased it, cause and effect seen, understood, contained. But now, that line has fractured. What once fell as one now falls as many, scattered across the dark, uncertain in direction, unpredictable in outcome. And that changes something deeper than tactics. It changes perception. Because the sky was never just a battlefield. It was a boundary, a place where threats could be stopped before they reached the ground, a place where control still existed. Now, that boundary feels thinner, more fragile, not gone, but no longer absolute. And so people still look up. When the sirens sound, when the first streaks of light cut through the darkness, they still watch. But they're not watching for the same reason, not just to see if the system works, but to understand what happens next. Because now, interception doesn't always mean safety, and silence doesn't always mean it's over. The sky no longer gives a clear answer, only fragments, only possibilities, only the sense that something has shifted in a way that cannot be easily reversed. And in that uncertainty, a new kind of reality takes hold, one where protection still exists, but no longer guarantees certainty, one where the difference between being safe and being exposed is measured not in what is stopped, but in what slips through. Because the sky hasn't changed in how it looks, only in what it allows. And once that changes, it never truly returns to what it was.